Right, hello everyone. It's good to have you with us for this History Indoors talk. It's great to have you all here as we look into the past and present to you with some history. If for those who don't know much about History Indoors, we provide history talks on a wide range of topics, ranging from, well, the ancient period all the way to the modern periods. And if any of that kind of stuff interests you, whether it's economic history, social history, military history, then please do subscribe to the channel. We are very close to 1,500 subscribers, which I'd love to us to get to that number. So please do subscribe if you're listening to this. We'd love to have you along and to have you part of the journey. So yeah, we would love to have you subscribing. We do have content on our channel, not just talks. We also have like film reviews and the like as well. So do check out all the old videos out as well, because I think there's some fantastic content. There's a lot of videos there now. So if you have a lot of time to spare, or you got a free lunch break, then it's certainly something you can check out in your free time. You often see me appear as well because I did quite a few of them as well. Just a little plug of myself there. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook as well. Yeah, I shouldn't say Twitter, should I? It's X now. Make sure I get the right terminology correct. So you can follow us on all social media platforms to keep up to date with what we've got going on, as well as also on our YouTube channel where we do put all the talks coming up now there as well. So do check all those things out. We've got some great talks coming up, ranging from the Ottomans all the way through to the Civil War as well, the British Civil War. So again, do stay in tune and then check for that. I think that's enough of History Indoors. I'm pretty sure I say it's enough. So if you are regular with us, you've probably heard this enough. I'm probably sick and tired of me saying that the introduction. But it's an absolute privilege for me to welcome Mark Jones again to speak for us, to give a talk. He gave a talk, I think, back in June. I think it was June, maybe May, but I think it's June.
Yeah, May, June, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a brilliant talk about the British Army and regimental system in the pre-First World War period, which again I learned a lot from. It was such a brilliant talk, so we had to have him back, and he was so happy that he has agreed to speak for us again. And again, another topic that I know nothing about, so I am so excited to listen to this and to kind of engage with this one. So thank you, Mark, again for coming to speak for us. Mark's doing his MA at the I think University of Wolverhampton.
Birmingham. Don't say Wolverhampton.
Oh no, I got it wrong. Oh, I was so sure that it was Wolverhampton at Birmingham. So whoops daisy. Don't no one say that. No one say anything outside this. But he's doing his MA there, and I know that looking forward to seeing how his research goes there as well. But I'll say bye for now. I'll come at the end where we have a Q&A session, so please do think about questions as well to ask, and then we'll ask them at the end. I'll appear at the end, but for now I'll disappear and Mark, it's all down to you.
Amazing stuff. Thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure to be here tonight, and thank you to all of you who have given up your Tuesday evening. My name is Mark. As you've heard already, I'm a student at the University of Birmingham, currently studying for a Masters in Military History. I am teasing about Wolverhampton. It's a fantastic institution. They run an absolutely brilliant course. However, today I'm going to be talking about the rise and fall of the 35th Bantam Division in the First World War. So I'm going to begin by giving a very brief introduction to the British Army on the eve of the First World War. I'll then introduce the volunteer movement that arose at the beginning of the conflict and the raising of what came to be known as Kitchener's Army. After that, we'll then cover the raising of one of these units, the 35th Bantam Division, introducing both its unusual origins, but also its recruitment and its training before its deployment overseas to the Western Front. At this stage, we'll talk about the 35th Division's service on the Western Front in 1916, its decline and its eventual rebirth, at which point I'll also briefly cover the division's remaining service in the years between 1917 and 1919. As per our usual custom, I'll do my best to answer any of the queries you might have at the end of this talk. And without further ado, I think we'll take it from there. Now, before continuing, there are a couple of important things I'd just like to point out very quickly. First and foremost, this is a history of the recruitment and the broad service of a British infantry division in the First World War. Although we'll cover some of the actions the division took part in, this talk is not designed as an operational history or a battlefield tour, and so these actions won't be covered in any extreme detail. In addition, this presentation does contain some references to discriminatory language. This is reflective of the prejudices and attitudes of the time when these first accounts were written, and I feel it's important to utilise these unedited versions of these accounts in order that we can really comprehend the attitudes and gain some insight into the prejudices faced by the men of the 35th Division. On a less serious note, during the course of this presentation, I will refer to various different locations across UK, France and Flanders. Although I've tried my best to ensure I'm using the correct pronunciation, I apologise in advance if it contains any errors. Now, whilst I'm sure many of you will be really very familiar with the British Army and British military terminology, I think it is just worth taking a moment just to quickly orientate ourselves about some of the terms that we're going to be using in this talk. Now, regiment is often used interchangeably with battalion. However, in the British Army, a regiment is an administrative unit made up of multiple battalions, all of which belong to the same regiment. By contrast, a battalion is a tactical unit of approximately 1,000 soldiers and a full strength, or rather 1,000 soldiers of full strength. However, in practice, it often comprises of rather fewer soldiers when in front line. We'll also be talking about brigades, which are a tactical formation, usually comprised of about 4 battalions and commanded by a brigadier general, although the term brigadier is also frequently used in this period. We'll also, of course, be talking about divisions, and these are tactical formations used in the First World War, which comprised usually of 3 infantry brigades, in addition to a variety of different support units, and again, under the command of a major general. And then finally, there'll be a couple of references to corps. Now, these are a different kind of organisation. They're an operational formation. They usually contain at least 2 divisions, and they include, again, various different supporting units and be commanded by a lieutenant general. So, without much further ado, let's get on to it then. Now, we could quite comfortably have an entire presentation on the origins of the First World War, but for the sake of brevity, I'll provide a brief overview here. On the 28th of June 1914, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated alongside his wife in Sarajevo. This act inflamed tensions that had been simmering away for much of the last 40 years between the various European great powers, namely Austria-Hungary and Germany on one side, and the French Third Republic and the British and Russian empires on the other. Over the course of the so-called July crisis, the various powers manoeuvred to gain an advantage over one another. However, on the 28th of July, Austria formally declared war on Serbia, and the various great powers began to mobilise their militaries, and a series of declarations of war were issued, with the British Empire, formally declaring war on the 4th of August 1914. Now, in 1914, the British Army held a unique position within Europe. It was easily the smallest of the armies of the European great powers, standing at approximately 700,000 men. By contrast, its ally France could mobilise approximately 1.7 million men, and its principal enemy, Germany, approximately 3.8 million. Little wonder then that the Kaiser referred to it as Britain's contemptible little army. Now, there are many reasons why the British Army was so small, including Britain's wider strategic needs and its emphasis on the Royal Navy as its principal line of defence. Most notably, however, the majority of the European powers, including both France and Germany, could mobilise large numbers of conscript soldiers. Britain, by contrast, had continued to rely on its professional army, the regulars, amounting to almost 250,000 soldiers, approximately half of whom would be stationed overseas at various locations across the British Empire. To bring its home forces up to strength, the British Army could mobilise some 200,000 reservists or special reservists, many of whom had previously served in the British Army. The Army could also rely on the volunteers of the Territorial Force. Formed in 1908 from the volunteer units of the Victorian Army, the part-time soldiers of the Territorial Force were intended to provide a further 320,000 men for the British Army. However, the Army estimates of September 1913 recorded that the Territorial Force contained approximately 245,000 officers and men, which left it well short of its peacetime establishment. Furthermore, the Territorial Force had been created with a view towards home defence. Soldiers of the Territorial Force would be required to volunteer in order to serve overseas, and units were often mobilised with out-of-date weaponry and equipment. Indeed, the soldiers in this photograph are most likely to be territorials due to the out-of-date equipment that they're wearing. So when the British Expeditionary Force went to war in 1914, it was comprised of something in the region of 160,000 men, formed into 6 infantry and 1 cavalry division. And these divisions contained some sorry, I've lost track of where I am. Some 72 infantry battalions and 14 cavalry regiments. Now, compared to the European powers, the Army's senior leaders, that is, its generals, its senior battalion officers, and its non-commissioned officers, often had some kind of experience. And indeed, many had actually seen action in the Boer War, where they'd faced not only a tough and determined enemy equipped with modern weaponry, but also an enemy that really forced the British Army to transform their approach to warfare, resulting in a well-trained, well-equipped force, which, man for man, equalled and may in fact even have been superior to many of its continental counterparts. However, we should be really careful in perceiving the BEF as being comprised of steely-eyed, mustachioed veterans of Africa and India. Many of its soldiers were relatively inexperienced, and the reserves comprised of much of its strength, and as much as 60% in certain battalions. Nonetheless, the BEF played a small but important part in the war on the Western Front, most notably at the battles of the Marne and the First Battle of Ypres in late 1914. However, it paid a terrible price for its bravery, sustaining some 90,000 casualties by the end of that year. Even with the support of reservists and newly deployed territorial force units, the BEF required rapid reinforcements. Now, the first source of reinforcement for the BEF came from the wider British Army, as battalions redeployed from various foreign garrisons to the Western Front. Ultimately, this would add a further 5 infantry divisions to the strength of the BEF. As already noted, the Territorial Force was called upon to support the regular army. Despite the misgivings of some commanders, the men of the Territorial Force overwhelmingly signed up for overseas service, and a number of units were serving in France by the winter of 1914. However, many more required training and re-equipping before being posted overseas, and in fact, the best part of 3 divisions had already been posted to various overseas garrisons to replace regular soldiers returning to the Western Front. The British Army could also call upon the officers and men of the Indian Army. Indian Expeditionary Force A, comprised of 2 infantry divisions and 2 cavalry brigades, had arrived in France as early as late December 1914. Now, the British government could also rely on the support of various colonial auxiliary forces, such as the King's African Rifles, who served extensively in the East African theatre, although none of these units would serve on the Western Front. Finally, across the British Empire, many answered the call for volunteers. This occurred most notably in the Dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, where entire divisions were raised for service overseas. However, even with these extensive forces, more soldiers would be needed to meet the needs of the British Army. And this is where this man comes into play. On the 5th of August 1914, Field Marshal Lord Kitchener was appointed Secretary of State for War. An influential figure within the army and the wider establishment, it was Kitchener's long-held belief that victory would only be achieved through the mass mobilisation of the British population. Within days of taking office, Kitchener had already sought parliamentary approval to increase the size of the army by 500,000 men. And by the 7th of August 1914, his famous slogan, "Your King and Country needs you," had already been printed in the morning papers. Kitchener's call to arms asked for 100,000 men to volunteer to serve in the army, and to serve for a period of 3 years or until the war was concluded. This request was met vigorously by the population of Britain, and by the 12th of September 1914, over 500,000 men had already enlisted. Recruits were expected to match age and nationality criteria, in addition to a range of physical standards. Medical examinations would grade candidates as to their suitability for active service, and would weed out the most unfit or unsuitable. Now, these volunteers were formed into a series of divisions that became the new armies, although they were also colloquially referred to as Kitchener's Army. As new waves of recruits arrived, new units formed and were grouped into divisions, and these divisions were initially built on the framework of the 6 existing regional commands in Britain and Ireland, with a division being raised in each region from battalions which recruited in that area. The exception to this rule was Southern Command, whose divisions instead were referred to as light divisions rather than Southern divisions. This process was once again repeated with the Second New Army, sometimes referred to as K2. However, limitations were already beginning to be realised, and some regions, most notably Scotland and Ireland, were not going to be capable of raising additional New Army divisions. For this reason, by the time K3 came into being, regional titles were dropped, although a number of these divisions could have justifiably claimed to have maintained a regional affiliation. Such was the rate of recruitment that the War Office was simply unable to deal with the mass of men coming forward to serve in the army. Increasingly, local recruiting committees took up the strain, and recruiting began to take on a much more of a local flavour. Although another motivation was the opportunity for recruits to join up from the same area and serve together in the same battalion, ensuring that recruits could join up alongside their friends and their colleagues. Now, there were a number of early adopters to this trend. The 13th Battalion of the Cheshire Regiment, for example, recruited extensively from the Lever Brothers factory at Port Sunlight. Similarly, Lord Derby's recruitment scheme in Liverpool yielded 1,500 recruits for the King's Regiment. Addressing the new recruits, Lord Derby said, "This should be a battalion of pals, a battalion in which friends from the same office will fight shoulder to shoulder for the honour of Britain and the credit of Liverpool." And thus the term Pals Battalion was born. Now, these battalions held many diverse origins, and it'd be impossible to go through them in any systematic way today. But some examples of these include the Birmingham City Battalions, the Barnsley Pals, the Grimsby Chums, the London Welsh, or the Tyneside Irish and Tyneside Scottish Brigades. Although principally an urban phenomenon, particularly in northern England, examples of rural Pals battalions also existed, such as Derbyshire's Chatsworth Rifles or the Yeoman Rifles, who recruited from the farming communities of Yorkshire and the North East. Whilst many Pals units were not formed on the basis of a regional identity, others very much lent into this. For example, the 31st Division was raised entirely from battalions recruited in Liverpool and Manchester. Other units were recruited on the basis of a shared identity. For example, several sportsmen and public schools battalions were formed across Britain. In Glasgow, separate battalions were recruited from members of the Boys Brigade and current employees of Glasgow Corporation's tramways, whilst in West Yorkshire, a wool textiles battalion was formed. However, it's a brigade of Pals battalions recruited from Hull for the East Yorkshire Regiment that are perhaps the best example of this trend. Forming in turn battalions of Hull commercials, tradesmen and sportsmen, a fourth battalion, simply lacking its own unique identity, simply referred to itself as T'others. It should also be noted that whilst many Pals units were infantry battalions, local initiatives resulted in the raising of a further 48 companies of engineers, 42 batteries of field artillery, and 11 ammunition columns. Despite the recruiting success that the new armies represented, a familiar issue came back to haunt the British Army. The physical health of the British population had long been a concern to the armed forces, and would form the basis of much post-war social reform. Bad health was most often a result of poor hygiene and unsanitary living conditions, particularly for Britain and Ireland's rural and urban poor. The British Army's pre-war recruitment often relied on recruits drawn from the lower classes, and many recruits were rejected on the basis of being underdeveloped, usually falling below the minimum requirements for chest size, itself a de facto measurement for lung capacity, but also for failing to reach height or weight requirements, although poor dental health was also a cause for many rejections. Now, the mass mobilisation of the British population in 1914 exacerbated these known issues, and many would-be recruits were turned away on account of their health. However, a side effect of this process was the exclusion of soldiers who fell below minimum height requirements, but were in all other respects fit to serve. This was particularly prominent within urbanised industrial and mining communities, where unsanitary conditions often arrested physical development in childhood. As a result, many potential recruits from these communities found themselves turned away from recruiting officers simply on the basis of their height. Now, as a result of this, Alfred Bigland, the MP for Birkenhead, petitioned the War Office to raise a battalion of undersized recruits for service in the British Army. Now, the exact genesis for the raising of the 1st Bantam Division remains shrouded in mystery, half-truth and fable. The history of the Cheshire Regiment in the Great War suggests that 4 miners from Durham travelled to Birkenhead to enlist in the Cheshire Regiment, where they were rejected on account of their height, even though they were in all other respects fit and healthy. Bigland's own post-war memoir, The Call of Empire, recounts the story of a local man who was rejected for being an inch below minimum height, having already attended and been turned away from several local recruiting offices. Irrespective of the origin of his inspiration, Bigland contacted the War Office and requested permission to raise a battalion of the men who fell below regulation heights, but were otherwise physically fit for service. Although the War Office were interested in the potential of such a scheme, they informed Bigland that it lacked both the time and resources to consider raising such a battalion. However, the War Office did say that they would authorise Bigland to raise his battalion and agreed to provide assistance in the form of uniforms, rations and equipment. Bigland next sought to try and get some financial backing from local organisations, most notably the local recruiting committee and the local town council, but both turned him down. As a result, Bigland agreed to take on the personal financial risk of raising these battalions. Within a matter of days, a depot was formed at the Bebbington Agricultural Sports Grounds, and a recruiting office was set up for the new battalion at Birkenhead's Town Hall. Now, I've mentioned the phrase Bantams a number of times, and it's worth us kind of just taking a bit of time just to kind of understand this. So the term Bantam itself is derived from a small, aggressive breed of poultry, although by the Edwardian era, the use of the term had widened to also refer to a small but spirited person. This language was often replicated in advertisements promoting Bantam units, with posters declaring, "Little men have made history, pluck can make up for inches," with others calling for "little men with stout hearts." And perhaps because of this, the men of the Bantam units readily adopted the image of the Bantam cock as their unit emblem, and it became very much synonymous with their identity. So although Bigland had intended to raise his new battalion from the men of Birkenhead, recruiting officers across Britain were notified that recruits measuring between 5 foot and 5'3" in height, with a chest measurement of at least 34 inches, and otherwise being fit and healthy for active service, were to be supplied with a railway pass to Birkenhead where they could enlist in his battalion. Now, it should also be noted that this isn't in fact the first time the British Army has done this, and in fact the Army had dropped the minimum height requirement for recruits during the recruiting crisis brought about by the Boer War in 1899. Recruiting officially opened on the 14th of November 1914, and within 3 days over 2,000 men had joined up, many having submitted a postal application in advance. Having exceeded the numbers needed for a single battalion, a second battalion was authorised within a matter of days, and we can see here on this photo the first of the recruits drilling on the Bebbington sports ground. Although efforts had been made to target the hardy mining communities in northern England, recruits came to Birkenhead from across Britain and represented a real cross-section of the socio-economic spectrum. If we look at this example from the Daily Sketch, for example, we'll notice from the image on the top right-hand corner that the very first recruit from the Bantam battalion, R.S. Parker, actually hailed from York. And again, we can see in the bottom left-hand corner that a group of miners travelled from as far away as Barnsley to join this unit. Bigland's scheme had actually proven to be so successful, however, that other recruiting committees requested permission to raise their own Bantam battalions. The War Office seized upon this opportunity to expand recruitment to encompass an entire division, and by April 1915 these battalions were consolidated as the 35th Division of the 4th New Army. Now, the new division was formed from 3 infantry brigades, with the first of these, the 104th, being comprised of battalions drawn from Lancashire. The 17th, 18th and 20th battalions of the Lancashire Fusiliers were primarily recruited from the mill towns of what we would now call Greater Manchester, whilst the 23rd Battalion of the Manchester Regiment were sort of a really curious amalgamation of Mancunian white-collar office workers and Wigan coal miners. The 105th Brigade hailed from Western Central England. The brigade included the original Birkenhead Bantam battalions, now retitled the 15th and 16th Battalions of the Cheshire Regiments, and was soon joined by the 15th Battalion of the Sherwood Foresters, who recruited extensively from the coal miners and lace workers of Nottinghamshire. Bristol's recruiting committee raised its own battalion, 14th Gloucesters, which was populated by a large contingent of Bantams drawn from the cities of Bristol and Birmingham, but also included miners from the Forest of Dean. Finally, the 3rd Brigade, the 106th, comprised of battalions recruited in the northeast of England and Scotland. The head of the Royal Scots Recruiting Committee, Lord Rosebery, spearheaded the recruitment of a Bantam battalion for his regiment, leading to the formation of the 17th Battalion of the Royal Scots, known henceforth as Rosebery's Own, whose manpower was primarily drawn from Edinburgh and the Lothian coalfields. Not to be outdone, Glasgow's Rotary Club formed a battalion of Bantams, 18th Highland Light Infantry. Although outfitted at the extent of the city corporation, a shortage of available material meant that the battalion, known colloquially as the Devil's Dwarfs, would not receive the kilts worn by other Highland Light Infantry battalions. The mining communities of County Durham also proved to be fertile ground for the recruitment of Bantams, leading to the formation of the 19th Battalion of the Durham Light Infantry, although the proportion of miners was leavened with men from the shipyards of Tyne and Wear. The city of Leeds also raised its own battalion, 17th West Yorks, in December 1914, and incorporated many recruits transferred from the oversubscribed Birkenhead battalions. As we can see from the regiments listed across these slides, recruitment for the 35th Division focused extensively on industrial Britain, with a particularly strong focus on Northern England and the central belt of Scotland. Now, it was decided that the 35th Division's supporting units, its artilleries, engineers and signallers, were not to be recruited as Bantam units, and instead they were raised in the same manner as other new army formations. The artillery brigades were formed in Aberdeen, Accrington, Burnley, Glasgow, which also happened to raise the divisional ammunition column, as well as West Ham, which taken together I can't help but think is a rather combustible mixture of people. The Royal Engineer Field Companies, by contrast, were all raised in Cambridgeshire, with a divisional signals company being raised in Reading. In common with other divisions at this time, the 35th also included mounted troops in the form of a divisional cyclist company and F Squadron of the Lancashire Hussars, a territorial force unit. Envisaged as scouts and lines of communication troops, the static nature of warfare meant that these units left the division in May 1916 and instead became corps-level assets. Finally, the Divisional Pioneer Battalion, 19th Northumberland Fusiliers, joined the division on the 16th of June 1915, having been raised by the Newcastle and Gateshead Incorporated Chambers of Commerce. Although trained as infantry, the Pioneers were a non-Bantam formation and served in a variety of important roles, providing both skilled and manual labour, but in the front lines, but also behind the lines as well. So the new division concentrated at Rumour Common near Massam in North Yorkshire, and as you can see, they even had time to produce their own postcards. Not long after, the division's first general officer commanding was appointed. Reginald Pinney, who previously commanded the 23rd Brigade of the 8th Division, like many other successful brigade commanders, was offered the command of a division as soon as one became available, and thus took command of the division on the 4th of July 1915. Now, many officers might have had some real misgivings, actually, about joining such an unusual formation. However, Pinney took a really active interest in drilling his new division and instilled in it an ethic of discipline, efficiency and aggression. Unfortunately, others did not share Pinney's enlightened view, and many held significant doubts as to the suitability of the division. One medical officer reported that it is impossible to expect undersized men to be useful as soldiers, whilst another lamented, it is well known that little men cannot bear the physical and moral load of modern warfare. Now, while recruits for the division have been relatively easy to find, the question of finding suitable officers and non-commissioned officers was a more complex process. Candidates with previous experience of the armed forces were sought out by the various recruiting committees. However, this necessitated the recruitment of men who did not fall within the physical requirements to be counted as true Bantams. Lieutenant Harry Stanton recalled that the 23rd Manchesters had an unusually tall complement of officers posted to them. This proved to be a matter of some consternation to Lord Kitchener, who, when inspecting the battalion, pointed out, these officers would immediately be signalled out as an easy target for snipers. As a result, officers of the Manchester Pals Brigade were measured for height, with the shortest being posted to the 23rd Manchesters to replace officers who were deemed to be too tall for a Bantam battalion. Now, we might be tempted to think of this as being an over-exaggeration, but if we look at this photo on the screen at the moment, I'm just going to take a moment to highlight this officer. And one of the things you'll notice is that it does appear to be rather conspicuous compared to the men who he's commanding around him. Now, this issue didn't just affect officers. And we have the fantastic example of the 6 foot 5 inch tall Benjamin Pearson, who, like many Bantams, had been turned away from many recruitment officers, although on this occasion for simply being too tall. He finally found a home, ironically, in the 16th Battalion of the Cheshire Regiment, where he was promptly promoted to sergeant, based, from what I can gather, on his height, if nothing else. Now, the division itself was later posted to Salisbury Plain for further pre-deployment training. However, it was noticeable that even with the apparent manpower crisis, the Army seemed hesitant to commit the division to combat, and the 35th Division watched with envy as other divisions were dispatched to the front whilst they remained behind. Now, although it suffered from many of the same issues of supply that affected most of the rest of the new army, the 35th Division was finally deemed to be ready for overseas service in December of 1915. However, perhaps surprisingly, the 35th Division were initially warned for service in Mesopotamia, the area covered by modern Iraq. Issued with tropical kit and helmets, the latter said to have given the Bantams the appearance of overgrown mushrooms, the division then discovered that the decision had in fact been reversed, and the division was now to be deployed instead to the Western Front, where it would land in France in February of 1916. Now, we might be tempted to think that the division was unlucky to find themselves sent to France, but in many respects this may have been a blessing in disguise. Mesopotamia proves to be a harsh and unforgiving theatre for British and Indian troops, with rampant disease, sparse medical care, and an enemy that proved tenacious in defence and would inflict a severe defeat on the Imperial forces at Kut al-Amara in April of 1916. Now, the 35th Division first entered the trenches in February of 1916, where they would form part of Lieutenant General Sir Richard Haking's 11th Corps. In common with many other newly arrived units, the 35th Division's brigades and battalions were divided between more experienced formation in so-called nursery sectors, areas of the front which weren't seeing as much active fighting. However, as this photo on the screen shows, even these quiet sectors could be very dangerous and conditions could be very, very poor. The Bantams were lucky in this regard, as they were able to learn from two battle-hardened divisions in the form of the Guards and the 19th Western Division, as well as the relatively inexperienced 38th Welsh Division. However, the reality of the service on the Western Front was soon struck home when the 35th Division took its very first casualty on the 20th of February 1916, with the death of Private William Catton of the 17th West Yorks. Indeed, some 30 men would be killed as a result of the daily activities of trench warfare, before having been involved in any offensive against the enemy. One man who was not killed as a result of enemy action, however, was Private James Archibald of 17th Royal Scots. In June of 1916, the 20-year-old from Edinburgh was court-martialed facing a charge of desertion. Regarded, rather callously in my opinion, as a typical slum product of poor intellect, he had nevertheless been considered to be a good soldier. Sadly, this would ultimately count for very little, and Private Archibald was executed by a firing squad on the 4th of June 1916, one of 306 soldiers to face the same fate. Now, between March and July of 1916, the 35th Division took its place in the line as a fully formed division, serving in the relatively quiet sectors between La Bonté and Festubert in northern France, later moving south to Neuve-Chapelle and the Ferme de Bois. Even these quiet sectors could be the scene of extensive fighting, and during this time the division became proficient as trench raiders, receiving praise both from their corps commander, Richard Haking, and the commander of the First Army, Sir Charles Munro. However, the 35th Division's first significant battles would not take place until July of 1916, with the onset of the Somme campaign. Let out of the BEF's initial order of battle, the 35th found themselves committed to the Somme battlefields piecemeal, with individual battalions and brigades being committed as reinforcements. The units of division entered the line on the 16th of July 1916, relieving units of the 18th Division to the southwest of Delville Woods and Longueval. On the 18th of July, 16th Cheshires repulsed a series of counterattacks at Waterloo Farm, whilst to the north, units of the 106th Brigade would fight a series of bloody skirmishes around Montauban. In the early hours of the 20th of July, 16th Cheshires made two unsuccessful attempts to capture Munster Trench, resulting in the loss of some 35 officers and men killed, 200 wounded and 7 missing. Later that morning, the 105th Brigade's 15th Battalion of the Sherwood Foresters attacked German positions between Arrowhead Head Copse and Moulds Hall Farm. Despite being exhausted from 2 days of bombardment in the phosgene-soaked trenches, some men of the Foresters made it into the enemy trenches, but ultimately were compelled to withdraw. This attack was followed hours later by a similar assault undertaken by the 104th Brigade's 23rd Manchesters, but met with similar results. In total, the attacking companies from both of these offensives suffered 375 men killed, wounded, or missing. A further attack on the 22nd of July by the 17th and 18th Battalions of the Lancashire Fusiliers was again repulsed for the loss of 18 killed and wounded, and 18 killed and 111 wounded. Throughout the remainder of July and into early August, the 35th would remain in the area of Delville Wood, holding the front line in the face of severe artillery fire. Battalions of the 106th Brigade would ultimately support the 2nd Division's successful capture of Delville Wood on the 30th of July. Whilst the 35th Division's artillery and engineers acted in support of a number of formations across the Somme battlefields, most of the infantry units were withdrawn. In August, the 35th Division was redeployed into 10th Corps areas of operation, where they attempted to refit and induct new drafts into severely depleted battalions of the division's 3 infantry brigades. It was at this time that a number of battalions began to notice that the new recruits they were receiving were noticeably of poorer quality than those who had come before. Despite raising concerns about this, the division's respite would be short-lived, as both the 24th and 35th Divisions were directed to attack Guillemont under the command of 14th Corps. However, by this stage, the 35th Division was a shadow of its previous self, and the divisional history remarked, when the opportunity finally came to act as a division and carry out attacks, which a month previously would no doubt have been crowned with success, the men who could have executed these orders were no longer there, and those who had taken their places were in many cases unfitted for frontline service that they were called upon to perform. Indeed, both Robin Pryor and Trevin Wilson have described the 35th Division as being physically inadequate for the task, an opinion that seems to have been shared by British commanders. Reduced to a supporting role for the attack on Guillemont, the 35th would also lose their commanding general, Reginald Pinney, who was transferred to the more actively engaged 33rd Division, with whom he would serve for the remainder of the war. Pinney's replacement was the 33rd's old commander, Major General Herman Landon, an officer who appeared to be better suited to what was perceived as a less active divisional command. Even if the division had been spared a direct assault on Guillemont, it still found itself embroiled in the attritional fighting that typified the campaign on the Somme, and its numbers continued to dwindle. In September, the badly defeated division was finally withdrawn from the Somme battlefields. Now, during the division's service in northern France and the Somme, it enjoyed something of a mixed reputation. As has already been noted, individual battalions and brigades had performed well at Delville Wood and Longueval, but the 35th Division as a whole had underperformed during their battles in August of 1916. The division's reputation amongst fellow soldiers also varied rather considerably. The division's practice of lowering the parapets of their trenches so that they were able to see over the top was not appreciated by many relieving units. And in fact, a company sergeant major of the Northumberland Fusiliers was heard to say on one occasion that, "Sir, them bloody little dwarfs had built up the fire steps so they could see over. Now when my lads stand up, half their bodies are above the parapet." I'm sure you're all pleased I didn't attempt to draw the accent at that stage. But it's these prejudiced attitudes towards the Bantam soldiers. It existed not just towards the soldiers of the 35th Division, but also to Bantam serving in other units. For example, Lieutenant R.F. Barton of 2nd Suffolk's complained that a draft sent to his battalion in 1916 comprised of Bantams of all people. Tiny little fellows they are to no discipline at all. However, others recognised that the Bantams could prove to be doughty fighters, and many lived up to the words of the popular verse, The British Bantams, which stated that each man was a pocket Hercules. In fact, one divisional war diary noted that the bond between the officers and men in these battalions was some of the best that they had seen on the Western Front. The 35th Division also was able to develop strong bonds of mutual respect with some of the units that they served alongside. Perhaps the most unusual of these was the Guards Division, perceived by many as an elite unit, and whose pre-war physical requirements called for tall, well-made men to serve as guards to the monarch. Perhaps surprisingly, the men of the Guards Division formed a close and mutually affectionate bond with the Bantams of the 35th Division, and Private Alec Thomas of the Coldstream Guards wrote, "After we finished telling the Bants that they had duck's disease, we had to take quite a lot of funny insults from them in turn. We've taken to the little chaps right away." So perhaps not quite the compliment he might have thought it was, but it was well meant nonetheless, I suspect. However, problems soon began to arise for the division. In September, the 35th Division was sent to the Arras sector for a period of what was euphemistically referred to as rest, but soon found themselves in a grinding cycle of patrolling, trench raiding, and intense artillery bombardment. At the same time, the physical condition of the division continued to decline, and sickness really became a significant issue, although, in fairness, sickness was also becoming a much broader issue for the army as a whole on the Somme battlefields. Matters came to a head, however, on the 26th of November of 1916, when a series of trench raids were launched against the 35th Division's positions. Worst affected were the 17th Battalion of the Lancashire Fusiliers, which suffered 2 killed, 7 wounded, but most surprisingly 24 missing presumed captured, whilst another man of 19th Durham Light Infantry was also captured in a separate raid. The nature of these attacks, coupled with the large number of men taken prisoner, raised alarm bells among senior officers in the division. Uncomfortable rumours also abounded that some of the captured men had actually taken the opportunity to desert. Now, we should recognise that trench raiding was a grim but fairly common aspect of trench warfare. Now, and whilst the number of soldiers captured was alarming, as was the panic that had overtaken some soldiers, many other Bantams had resisted ferociously. When 15 Sherwood Foresters were raided on the same night, 6 raiders attempted to abduct Private Harsnip. Despite suffering a broken leg and being stabbed and shot by his assailants, Harsnip fought off his would-be kidnappers and fortunately lived to tell the tale. However, by this stage the damage had been done. In the words of the divisional history, it was brought forcibly to notice that which had been reported for some time, namely that the major part of the recently received reinforcements could not be trusted to hold the line. Thus, when the division came out of the line in early December, both Landon and the 35th Corps commander, Lieutenant General Alma Haldane, neither of whom could really be considered great advocates of the division, reported their concerns to the Army Medical Services. It should be noted that this in itself wasn't exactly a new concern, and an inspection completed by the medical services in August of 1916 had already seen 50 men withdrawn from the division and dispatched to labour units for being unfit to serve in the front line. Oh, hold on, try again. There we are. So, as we can see from the war diary of the Assistant Director of Medical Services for the 35th Division in November of 1916, an inspection was ordered to look at the fitness of soldiers in the division's infantry battalions. This inspection subsequently found that an astonishing 1,439 men were unfit for frontline service. A second inspection removed a further batch of soldiers, bringing the total to 2,784. The reality of the matter, simply put, was that it was not possible to maintain a Bantam formation in the field. Now, as already has been noted, this perhaps shouldn't have been a total surprise to senior commanders, given the division's experiences on the Somme and at Arras. However, the experience of a fellow division should have perhaps alerted the War Office to this issue at a much earlier opportunity. The success of the raising of the 35th Division had led the War Office to commence planning for a second Bantam division. This new division, the 40th, was initially formed from the Welsh 119th Brigade, the Anglo-Scots 120th Brigade, and an English 121st Brigade. However, ultimately, only the 119th were accepted as a fully Bantam formation. The recruiting difficulties that would ultimately come to halt the 35th Division took root far earlier in the 40th, which struggled to find sufficient recruits to form its Anglo-Scottish Bantam brigades. Ultimately, 2 battalions each within the 120th and the 121st Brigades were disbanded and replaced with 4 battalions transferred from the 39th Division. As had already been experienced by the 40th Division a year earlier, subsequent waves of Bantam recruits simply did not meet the stringent physical requirements needed for active service, resulting in many unfit men being sent as replacements to the division. A decision that the 40th and now the 35th Division found to their cost. The men who had been declared unfit from the 35th Division were withdrawn, and most were subsequently transferred to the Labour Corps, whose cap badge we can see on the left-hand side. The units of the Labour Corps played a vital role in helping to support the work of frontline divisions by conducting manual labour behind the lines. But unsurprisingly, this was a deeply disappointing development for many Bantams who had joined up to serve in the infantry. Many were also upset by the seemingly arbitrary decisions that were being made as to which soldiers were fit to serve and which were not. Instead, their places were filled from a variety of different resources, with many men in the initial wave of replacements being transferred from disbanded yeomanry regiments. For example, 18th Light Infantry, the Devil's Dwarfs, was subsequently retitled 18th Glasgow Yeomanry Battalion after they absorbed many of the men from that unit into their ranks. As the army recruitment crisis deepened throughout 1970, many soldiers found themselves transferred from other supporting arms into the ranks of the infantry. 17th Lancashire Fusiliers, for example, received drafts of men primarily drawn from the Royal Engineers Inland Waterways and Docks units in October of 1916. From this point onwards, the division would accept any recruits who met the Army's physical standards. And although Bantams would continue to serve within its ranks until the end of the war, the 35th Division's Bantam experiment was officially over. To symbolise this new beginning, the 35th Division's familiar Bantam cock emblem was replaced with a new one, the 7 5s, a cog-like emblem which added up to the number 35. As can be seen from the attached photo, the division would use this emblem for the rest of the war. Whilst the division was no longer a true Bantam formation, I think it's important to finish the story of the division, and for this reason I'll sum up the division's service in 1917 and 1918 over the course of the next couple of slides. Now, even with these changes, the division's future remained fairly uncertain. The weeding out process took time to accomplish, and in fact, the last unfit troops were not removed from the division until March of 1917. This left some battalions particularly under strength, and for example, the 15th Cheshires in March of 1917 consisted of just 400 men, well below its establishment figure. Now, on the 17th of March, after supporting a French attack to the south and noting the lack of response, the 17th Battalion of the West Yorkshires entered the German front line and reported it to be empty. The division conducted a general advance, and by the end of the day had pushed forward 2 miles, an astonishing distance by 1917 standards. The West Yorkshires and other units up and down the Allied front had discovered Operation Albrecht, the German withdrawal from the front line positions to a new series of fortifications collectively referred to as the Hindenburg Line. Although a general pursuit was ordered, the 35th Division would not take part in these operations and was instead put to work salvaging and repairing road and rail communications in the area. In April, as the BEF launched its great offensive at Arras, the 35th found itself relegated to the now secondary area of operations on the Somme, where they engaged in a variety of small operations around Gricourt. In July, the division found itself in the area around Eprouet, where it would spend the next 3 months. It was during this time that Second Lieutenant Hardy Faulkner, Parsons of the 14th Gloucesters, was awarded the Victoria Cross. During a nighttime attack on the outpost he was commanding, Parsons single-handedly held his post despite being horrifically wounded by the blasts of a flamethrower. Sadly, Lieutenant Parsons would not survive his injuries, but he was awarded the Victoria Cross for his actions. Now, although the division would be largely relegated to secondary duties during the Great Offensive at Ypres in 1917, better known to many as the Battle of Passchendaele, the division itself was involved in a joint Anglo-French attack at the Houthust, a location just to the north of the Ypres salients. The diversionary attack was intended to dislocate German forces and prevent them from reinforcing their positions at Malmaison and Passchendaele. Although the tactical outcome of this battle was inconclusive, the successful attack at both of these locations resulted at least in part from the actions of the 35th Division at Houthust. Regardless, the fighting proved to be the bloodiest since the division's service on the Somme, with 368 killed, 1,734 wounded, and 463 missing between the dates of the 18th to the 25th of October. The 35th Division would remain in Flanders until March in 1918. But during this time, the division, in common with the wider BEF, underwent a period of significant transformation. Simply put, by the end of 1917, Britain was running short of manpower for its armies. In early February, British divisions were restructured so that their 3 brigades would now consist of 3 battalions rather than 4. This required significant reorganisation and resulted in many battalions being disbanded, transferred between brigades, and sometimes being transferred to entirely new divisions. In the case of the 35th Division, the 20th Lancashire Fusiliers and the 23rd Manchesters were both disbanded, and replaced in turn by 19th Durham Light Infantry, which was transferred from the 106th Brigade. 105th Brigade would lose both the 16th Cheshires and the 14th Gloucesters, who were replaced by a battalion from the North Staffordshire regiments. And finally, 18th Highland Light Infantry, the Devil's Dwarfs, they were unfortunately disbanded and amalgamated with a newly incoming battalion of the Highland Light Infantry, the 12th, which had been transferred from the 15th Scottish Division. Now, the division itself was perhaps fortunate to be out of the line when the German army launched its spring offensive on the 21st of March 1918. Known as the Kaiser's Battle or Kaiserschlacht, this was an attempt by the German army to break through the Allied lines, utilising its temporary advantage in numbers, resulting from the withdrawal of divisions from the Eastern Front. The 35th Division found itself returning to the Somme region, where it helped stabilise the line and allowed the BF to form new positions on the western bank of the Ancre River. It was during these actions that the division was awarded its second Victoria Cross, when Lieutenant Colonel William Herbert Anderson of 12th Highland Light Infantry was recognised for his leadership and bravery during a counterattack to Maricourt on the 25th of March. His citation noted that the counterattack drove the enemy from his position, but resulted in this very gallant officer losing his life. He died fighting with the enemy within the enemy's lines, setting a magnificent example to all of those who were privileged to serve under him. A sad coda to this story is that Anderson was in fact one of 4 brothers, all of whom were killed during the First World War. Following these battles, the division was at the forefront of the great Allied counter-offensive known as the 100-Day Offensive. Between the 8th of August and the 11th of November, the 35th Division would be at the forefront of the fighting in Flanders, ending the war on the eastern bank of the River Dender, just on the border of Belgium and Holland. Now, the division itself was not destined to form part of the army of occupation that would occupy Germany after the First World War, but for the next few months it would be stationed around Saint-Omer. The division was gradually disbanded over this time, and many of the first soldiers to be released from service were desperately needed ex-miners. The division would itself be formally disbanded in April of 1919. Over the course of its war service, the division would suffer some 23,915 casualties. Certainly not the largest number by a division, but a significant number in of itself. So what do we make of the Bantam experiment in retrospect? Certainly it's hard to argue that the 35th Division was one of the elite divisions of the British Expeditionary Force. Now, I'll admit to being fairly wary of trying to judge the eliteness or effectiveness of individual units. After all, military units are ever-evolving formations. Some may in fact prove to be consistently effective, and others consistently ineffective. But for many, the answer lies somewhere in between these two extremes. Paddy Griffiths, one of the finest historians of the British Army in the First World War, considered this question of what he referred to as the assault spearhead of the BEF. In this study, he covered the service of the 35th Division, but noted that, unlike many of its contemporaries, the division was consistently underused as an attacking formation. By contrast, Peter Simpkins noted in his study of British divisions during the 100 Days Offensive that a host of supposedly average divisions employed a range of really quite skillful small unit tactics during this campaign. Included amongst this number was the previously unfancied 35th Division. Thus, the 35th Division during the First World War is open to some interpretation. Even if we accept that the division fought well in the early battles of the Somme in 1916 and in the crucial actions of 1918, we must also recognise that the division declined in effectiveness over the course of 1916, and it was ultimately rendered combat ineffective by the end of that year. During the course of 1917, it was regarded by many as the darkest year for the Allies. The 35th was to get relegated to a series of secondary areas of operation, and its absence from the great battles of 19, most notably Arras and Third Ypres, is noticeable. Ultimately, whilst we would be right to consider the formation of the Bantam units as a triumph for equality, allowing large numbers of soldiers to fight for their country, the challenges of sustaining such a formation in the field could and should have been recognised. If the British Army had spent more time thinking about how they were going to sustain the units in the field and less time about whether soldiers under average height would be capable of fighting, arguably the 35th Division might have achieved a lot more. Nonetheless, the Bantams of the 35th and 40th Divisions more than played their part during the First World War.
I do believe Mark has just frozen, if I'm correct, unless he's had a massive pause. So do stay with us a second while we do um, get him back. So don't go anywhere just yet. He's coming back. I think his PC crashed. So do stay um, for a moment because we'd like to have some questions as well that you can ask him. Um, but I'm glad that you have all enjoyed it. That is a great thing. While we're waiting, how about why don't we think about questions to ask as well? So do think about some questions to ask because we would love to um, love to ask them. So rather than use this time on Wednesday, we can definitely think about. I'm thinking of questions myself, so hopefully you lot are as well. and I like it. Or if you get any questions from me about history indoors while we wait, please do ask them. I'm more happy to answer anything while we do wait for Mark to come back. But I am informed that he is on his way, so don't worry about that. The problems when you rely on technology. Certainly is. I'll put the banner on while I wait. Haven't done already, do like and subscribe to the video. Mainly so you can reach more people. We have had some issues with our so we're looking for ticketing service because we had to move away from Eventbrite onto Ticketailor. So which has probably has impacted the amount of people we normally reach. So do like and share if you can because we'd love to see numbers even higher later on. Also do subscribe because we're close to 150 subscribers. Although 1,500. I do apologise that you have to stare at me for the last few moments. I did not something that anyone really wants to have on their evening, but hopefully he'll be back soon. I think his PC crashed. So, are there any questions people would like to put in the chat? So when he comes, we can ask him those questions when he comes back. Ah, he's back. There we go.
Well, nightmare. It does feel like I'm cursed with these talks, although at least it's at the end of the presentation and not midway through.
That's true. This has happened before, so this is happened the last one.
Yeah, I'm moving house for the next one, I think.
Yeah. He bought a new PC, and then he has to buy a new house.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we basically were on the final slides, weren't we? Which was just some books, I think.
Yes, about the books. Yes.
Yeah. Basically, or the only thing to add at that stage is just simply to say, if you do want to find out a bit more about the Bantam divisions or the service of the Bantam divisions in the First World War, there are a few different things. There are a few different books out there. If anyone has any questions about that, I'm more than happy to answer. And Michael's got my details, so if anyone wants to email in, then more than happy to answer any questions.
Brilliant. I'll just add that. Yeah, if you do want to ask any questions or you want to take things further, then if you email just the History Indoors email, for example, or myself, we can definitely pass it on to Mark and whatnot. So please do so if that's the case, because we love to kind of pass these things on. And start that conversation and start those kind of debates as well, and conversations and kind of those links. So please do. Yeah, no, that was absolutely fantastic talk. I knew nothing about that division and their involvement as well, and to kind of think about their formation to their disbandment in 1919 as well, as you pointed out, things to think about. We have got a question already in. I mean, people were saying, how much they love to talk, but I'll put them up there so you can see.
Oh, thank you.
People have loved to talk, but we have got a question, which I think is a good, interesting question as well. You may have covered this, but did anything change after World War I about height and weight limits? Did this change anything, or did things go back to what they were before?
This is a really good question, and I know Dr. Wendy. So hi, Wendy. It is a really good question, which I don't have a particularly great answer for. I think essentially what my understanding is that effectively the various kind of physical requirements for the army went back pretty much to normal at the end of the First World War. I mean, effectively what happens is that the British Army, having grown to a huge size by the end of the First World War, rapidly starts to shrink and reduce. And so as a result, I think the army could go back to being quite choosy about who it was looking for. And I mean, the actual kind of interwar history of the British Army is really interesting and probably a little bit understudied, if truth be told. And I think when you consider everything that happened in that period, like the Great Recession, the various kind of social challenges that were taking place in Britain at that time, I think it's not surprising that occurred, and that, you know, sort of, yeah, it's a difficult one to answer. And truth be told, I mean, it's the wrong war for me. But even with the Second World War, I'm not quite sure what the requirements were. But by the same standards, it was a very different army by that stage. You know, there was much less of a focus on infantry units and much broader appreciation. I mean, for a start, you have an entirely new service in the form of the Royal Air Force, which of course hadn't existed in 1914. I've just noticed one of the comments from Mike Taylor, and yeah, absolutely, I would really endorse his book No Bad Soldiers. It's absolutely brilliant and covers the service of the 40th Division really well, and it's absolutely definitely recommended. I just couldn't fit it on the slide, Mike.
That's brilliant. I'll put that there so people can follow it when once they get to that. Good question here, actually, from Alan. Did the Germans do the same? Do you know if they did the same?
So this is a really interesting question. I feel really awful because I say this is a really interesting question and then I don't know the answer. But yeah, I did look into this, and I also looked into the French army as well, because I must admit, I'm always really interested to see kind of what both the French and Germans are doing, and obviously accepting that cuts off a huge number of combatants in other theatres as well. But from my knowledge, I think it's an interesting one, because obviously the German army was structured so very differently from the British army. You have this really extensive system of conscription, so actually a significantly larger portion of the population had some experience of military service and could be called up really rapidly to increase the size of the army. And that's very different with the British army, because they're having to effectively grow an army from scratch. You know, you have the regular army, you have the territorial force. Territorial force isn't, I think, is really maligned and is unfairly maligned, both by commentators at the time and then some historians in the time that taken past since that. But I think it proved to be a very effective formation, and actually some of the best divisions of the First World War were territorial formations. But for some, it took quite a long time to kind of get them into a position to be able to get into the fight. And in fact, by the time most of the territorial divisions are starting to deploy, you're also seeing the deployment of the first new army divisions, which gives you an idea of kind of how long that process could be for some units. I've completely drifted off the question that Alan asked, so I do apologise. So the honest answer is I'm not sure, but there probably wasn't quite the same requirement to bend the rules in the German army, at least in 1914 and 1915, compared to the British army, which really had a lot of work and really needed to catch up to become a viable fighting force effectively.
Yeah, that's certainly maybe something for further research and whatnot. Maybe to look into that. I mean, I've got a few questions. I mean, as you know, I'm as a historian, I look at the Civil War and urban town planning. So that's a very different background I have, really. But I'm interested, kind of this attitude that it kept coming throughout the talk of because they're smaller in height, that they have lesser bravery or lesser stout hearts. This kind of attitude. And I wondered, do you know, why is that the case? Where's this come from? Has it origins anywhere, or was it just because of kind of a very militaristic Victorian society? I just wanted to know if that's a reason.
I think, again, it's a really good question. I think I don't want to say it was a more prejudiced time, because I think prejudice prejudice. I think in some respects we're more aware of prejudice nowadays than we were before, but I think it's always existed. There was, I mean, the periods of the early 20th, late 19th century. I think there are some really interesting kind of competing ideas that are taking place within the Western world, in particular, around the right kind. What is the right stuff, both in terms of humanity, but also in terms of like fighting soldiers and armies. And a lot. I mean, sometimes the sort of the European armies in the kind of periods between kind of 1900 to 1914 are often kind of lambasted as if kind of to use the phrase of one historian, sleepwalking into conflicts. But the reality is actually they spend a significant amount of time thinking about how they are going to fight the next great continental war. And they look into this in lots of different ways, certainly in terms of technology and in tactics. And some of those things work, some of those things really don't work. But underpinning this as well is this idea of like sort of are soldiers going to be able to cope with the rigors of modern combat? And there was genuine concern in some corners of certainly of the British Army, and I would also argue in other European armies, that there was a significant concern that your average soldier just wouldn't be able to cope with modern conflict. It would be just too terrible a thing. And therefore, the response to that is that you have to indoctrinate soldiers to fight in a certain way. And different armies take different approaches to this. So in Britain, there's much more of a focus on putting greater responsibility on junior soldiers and individual fieldcraft, and that's very much based on their experiences of the Boer War. If you compare that to Germany, for example, right up to 1914, even though there's quite an internal debate within the German army, for most officers, their belief is actually you need to keep your soldiers under close command, and the best way to do that is to keep them in kind of big formations where everyone's within close distance to each other, where everyone can hear you shouting orders. And that they're going to be able to kind of just attack and almost kind of disregard their casualties in order to achieve their objectives. Mm-hmm. And all of the European armies kind of swing backwards and forwards on what the right approach is to that. And I think then the decision about actually not just kind of what the right moral fiber and mental capacity of soldiers is considered, but then beyond that as well, I think it's actually kind of the physical condition of soldiers as well. So yeah, I think it kind of falls into old prejudices about sort of, if they're smaller or lighter or a different gender or whatever, or they're not manly enough, they're not going to be able to cope as soldiers. And of course that's ridiculous, because human beings are incredibly resilient creatures, regardless of their kind of physical attributes. But yeah, a lot of these prejudices die really hard, and a lot of soldiers kind of really face this. And certainly in the case of the British Army as well, there was this long-standing debate around the quality of recruits. I mean, I talked about this in my last talk, and I covered it a little bit in this talk as well about, Victorian and Edwardian Britain was a really unhealthy place to live, and lots of people were really undernourished. I mean, you hear these colloquial, certainly from like first-hand accounts of soldiers joining up in this kind of period, who kind of, even after a few weeks of army food, which isn't particularly nutritious or great, they actually kind of physically grow in height and stature because they're actually getting the first kind of like regular sustained food intake in their lives. So it's not surprising that there were like big chunks of the population just weren't really fit for service. And where the Bantams come into this, there are of course these communities where you do have like a lot of deprivation, but still very fit and active people. They just happen to be shorter than average. And 5 foot or 5 foot 2 inches. It's very short by today's standards, but it was still pretty short even by the standards of the early 20th century as well.
Yeah, and certainly, it's certainly interesting, isn't it? I think you're right, and there's a lot of factors that play into it as well, which I think is interesting. Something that I might have to do a bit of thing myself, because the Victorian society, certainly very, very interesting in that way. We've got another question. Before I've got those questions, but people don't hear my questions. So then thank you for your talk. But do you think there was not enough time to catch up on the 1904 Fitzroy reports?
So I'll preface this by saying I'm not hugely familiar with the Fitzroy report, although I have come across this. I think Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. I think there are a lot of investigations, particularly in the British Army, between the kind of the end of the Boer War and the beginning of the First World War, and there are kind of a whole series of different commissions. There's some of the kind of the more famous ones are things like the Isha report that really looks into kind of the structure of the British Army, Haldane's reforms that bring about the kind of creation of the territorial force, and again a big reorganization of the army. And I think part of the problem was that much of the British Army was really quite idiosyncratic, in the sense that you could create sort of I won't use the word doctrine because there's a big debate within this period of study about whether the British Army even had doctrine at this time. But certainly in terms of kind of regulations and tactical approaches and things like that, it really varied between different bits of the army. Some parts of the army were more conservative than others. Sometimes it came down to individual officers. Actually, if the colonel doesn't think it's worth learning about marksmanship, the battalion doesn't learn about marksman, like doesn't practice its marksmanship and spends its time running around the field instead. So there's kind of a lack of oversight within that. And so when you look at things like the Fitzroy report and the recommendations that come into that, they often filter down through the army in kind of very different ways. And some units really take this on board and some units won't. And it varies tremendously across the army. Not to mention the fact that lots of units, particularly those serving overseas, are, they can be located in really kind of sparse locations. I mean, I was looking at kind of where all the various different battalions of the British Army redeployed from at the beginning of the First World War. And if you look at like the Essex Regiment, for example, they had a battalion, half of which was on Mauritius and half of which was in South Africa. So you've just got to bring both those kind of bits of the regiment together, the battalion together, to then ship it back to Europe. But imagine trying to kind of developed a kind of a systematic system of training between when you've got units which are located thousands of miles away from each other. It is really tricky.
Yeah, I completely agree. I can imagine the communication issues as well that arise from the division has spread that far away as well, especially in that time as well. I mean, I know you've got the improvements in communication, but still, I mean, it's
still going to take time.
It still takes time. I've got one more question. My question is probably a stupid question because I don't really know. But he said in your talk that they formed quite early in 1914. I think that November, was it 1914, and they first deployed at the end of 1915. Is that quite a long period of time for the division to be deployed? It feels like it's a long, for me anyway. It feels like it's a long period of time. Or was that quite the normal for division to kind of have that time to be deployed?
So, yeah, it's. I think its answer is a little bit. I suppose is yes and no, in the sense that it is quite. It's probably longer than the average of most divisions, but probably not by much.
Okay.
And I think the reason, and there's probably kind of two different reasons for this. I mean, I'm not an expert on the new armies, and I wouldn't pretend to be. My kind of knowledge tends to kind of focus a little bit before this period. But there's obviously, so you have this immediate kind of reaction within Britain, and you see this mass wave of recruiting that comes up with, particularly with the first kind of the, K1 and K2, those first 12 divisions. And some of those are kind of deploying relatively quickly. They're being formed in sort of, September, October of 1914, and then they're on the Western Front by about the middle of the next year. And when you consider it, you are literally taking, I mean, it feels like almost a bit trite to say this, but you're taking from civilians to soldiers. Much of the army is in France or coming back from the Empire to serve in France. There's a lack of instructors. There's a lack of suitable officer candidates. So you're having to recruit a lot of junior officers in particular from scratch. They're digging out senior officers from all over the place. I mean, a lot of officers of the Indian Army, for example, who are on leave in Britain in 1914, get swallowed up by the British Expeditionary Force because there's a desperate need to find officers. Others are being, you're getting retired officers in their 60s and 70s who are being called out to drill new recruits. So it's a huge process of growing an army from scratch, and not just growing it, but finding equipment, finding supplies, finding all of those kind of things to actually make it a viable formation.
Yeah, 100%. It's just one of those things where when you kind of just, I think in your mind you see as a year, you think, because in your mind you think the army gets deployed really, really quickly. You know, you think they sign up, they get sent off like in 2 weeks, because that's how sometimes the the lot of public history kind of presents it sometimes. So that's why I thought, yeah, that's a long time. But as you said, it was it was generally kind of linked to similar to others. Another question. We'll end on this last question then, because someone's put a question, so we'll end on this one. Which is interesting. So Isaac Rosenberg was both Jewish and a Batman. Does his poetry in Trent just cover the experiences of them, or was it kind of focus on just the kind of universal experience of the war?
I'm going to do it again, and I'm really sorry for this. So I'm going to fully admit I'm aware of Isaac Rosenberg. I haven't read any of his poetry specifically. I think this is a fault of mine. If I'm being completely honest, I'm not. I generally tend to avoid the war poets. That makes me a really bad person, because actually it's an important part of understanding the kind of the culture of the First World War and the kind of the experiences of those combatants. It's something I need to get better at. Mea culpa, I think, essentially. I'd be hugely surprised if it wasn't influence, even if it's not kind of covering specific influences. I'd be hugely surprised if his experiences as you say, it's both as as a Bantam I'd be amazed if it didn't have some influence on his poetry at all. But I'm afraid to say, Alan, I don't know the answer to that, and I'm really sorry.
I was actually no worries at all. But it's a massive topic as well. There's a lot of things going on, so we'll let you off.
No, thank you. I mean, and to pick up on kind of the points you made earlier as well, I do think kind of I think the Bantams in general, but kind of particularly the 35th Division, I think it really does. I think you could really benefit from having that reinvestigation. So there've been some great. There's some really good unit histories of various Bantam units. I mean, one of the ones I would have mentioned if my computer hadn't kicked me out would have been Alan McGreal's book on the Cheshire Bantams, which is a really good kind of battalion history of those two units, but actually works as a really good divisional history as well. Likewise, the kind of the post-war divisional history that was written by officers of the 35th Division and is now published through Naval and Military Press. Again, it's a really good resource. It's really well written. It's, in my opinion, one of the better divisional histories that were written in that period. But it's still a unit, I think, that could really benefit from further academic investigation. I think particularly around things like kind of morale in particular, I think it would make a really fascinating study, because it's such a unique example. Well, it's such an unusual example. And likewise, like, again, I'm one of these people who's a little bit, combat effectiveness, I think there's always the risk it turns into a bit of a kind of a top trumps of sort of this division's better than this division and all the rest of it. But I think kind of investigating kind of some of those, if you like, some of the slurs puts against the kind of against the Bantam Division, that they're ill disciplines, that they run away from the fighting, and that, there's plenty of evidence that kind of disagrees with that. And I think it'd be really good for someone to kind of look at that with a kind of a sort of a neutral view, and to kind of critically assess really the accuracy of both those statements, or what caused that. I think it would be a really fascinating study, which I'm not doing. So that's definitely out there for somebody else to do. So I think it's definitely a unit that could, even though there's some great stuff out there about it, I think you could definitely benefit from some further investigation. Although, as we've heard already, Mike's work on the 40th Division and 119th Brigade, I think he's doing a really good job of that within the 40th Division framework. We just need someone to be looking at that from the 35th Division as well.
100%. I think also you're right. I mean, I'll be fascinated to see as well about that kind of public perception of of them, and the slurs that are used, and where do they come from, where do they originate from? Was there causality, or was it just just slander? Whatever it is, it'd be interesting to see what actually it was. So, food for thought. Let's say that, food for thought. And it's what's good. This is what historians do. We always create more questions. This is what we do. This is what we love doing. So, they're brilliant. Anyway, we should probably be in the end of the questions there, because we've gone through a few, and certainly been enjoyable. And thank you, Mark, for that. It was absolutely fantastic. I mean, everyone here has said how much they've loved it, how much they've enjoyed it, how much they learned from it. So thank you so much. Thank you everyone who's been here as well. We thank you for all your contributions and your questions, because they've been really exciting and very kind of in-depth questions as well. So thank you for your questions. We do have talks coming up in 2 weeks' time, and talks coming up throughout until winter. So do make sure you keep your eye out for those talks as well. We would love to have you along for those talks as well. But thank you again to you, Mark, because it's been a fantastic talk. I've learned so much from it, and I definitely will have to be doing my own kind of investigations and hobby looking, because it's something sparked interest in me. So thank you very much, and we will say bye for now. So
awesome. Thank you all. Cheers.